sit very well there.
I don't know.
Just
I think I
don't let
better stick
it
with
might
one. I'm
slip.
afraid that
I think this
I'll
one,
end up on the floor.
this one won't slide. If it's sitting
Turn
there,
this mic
Okay.
off.
plenty tight now.
Okay.
That work?
Low, but
Kind of low. You want it without it?
yeah, I'll do it without. I'll do without the cushion.
Okay. Do this one. There you go.
Let's see. Yeah, that's better. Well, I used to do that routine with my drumming. Test, test. Okay. Oh, well, since you went to all the trouble to bring it up here, sure. I'll put my butt on it. What did you give me here? Jeez.
Maybe try this one.
Yeah, let me try that one.
You want me to tie it on there?
Let's see. Yeah.
Tie it on?
You know, I don't really need that.
You don't? Okay.
Nah, this is better.
So what if while we're waiting for other people to show up, we just have some Q&A if people want to ask you some questions?
Okay.
Hey, everybody. The rest of the crowd isn't back yet. I think some people are assuming, since we've been a little bit late all day, that we're going to be a little bit later. It's all my fault, of course, yeah. But I thought while we're waiting for other people, if you all would like to ask a question or connect with Randall, we have a mic right over here. You could line up over there and ask Randall some questions. Maybe? Tiggers?
Okay.
There's a mic right up here if you could.
We got a hoist up?
She's got it.
I better have some answers now.
Randall, nice to see you again.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
I was with you up in Cortez, Colorado for an amazing, with Chimney Rock, we had an amazing 3-day workshop
Yeah.
retreat up there. You know, so I was thinking if I was going to ask you anything, it would be, and it's not the correct name in its native tongue, but about Devil's Tower. Could you speak a little bit about Devil's Tower in Wyoming?
It's a volcanic diatreme, and it was lava that came up from deep down into the mantle. It's also called a volcanic neck. I know people are saying it looks like a tree stump. It does, kind of, but it's definitely volcanic. It's made out of basalt. And to me, the significance of Devil's Tower is that you have to realize that when it formed, what is now the top of the tower was the ground level, the level of the ground around it. So what that means is that all of the softer sedimentary material, probably mostly sedimentary rock in that region, has been eroded away. So there has been an enormous, inconceivably huge amount of material that has been removed that exposed the diatreme. So then that raises the question of what forces and over what span of time
That's right.
was that material removed. And of course, the old models is everything happened very slowly, 1 grain of sand, 1 drop of water at a time. And for a lot of the times it does. But then there are these interruptions in the normal pace of things when things in the geological realm happen orders of magnitude faster than what we've experienced in our lifetimes, what we've experienced in the time, let's say, that civilization has appeared on the earth. And that is because I think this is one of the ideas that I have advocated for a long time, is that civilizations arise in the intervals between catastrophes. And given that modern Homo sapiens sapiens is as much as 200,000 years old, or maybe older, I think it's very realistic to speculate that there may have been multiple ancient civilizations that were erased in great catastrophic upheavals that we have absolutely no knowledge about. Because once you understand the scope and magnitude of some of these events that transpire on the Earth, you realize that, well, given 2 or 3 episodes of catastrophic change, each episode erases pretty much the world that's there. Then another episode of catastrophism even juxtaposes on that. And by the time, if we go back through the last 200 to 250,000 years, there's probably been at least 4 complete cycles of glaciation and interglaciation. So you can imagine when a glacier the size of Antarctica swallows up 2/3 of North America, whatever was there before that glacier came, what's going to be there afterwards? Then when you add in the fact that the glacier doesn't just melt in a nice, easy fashion, it melts catastrophically and discharges volumes of water that can only be compared in their magnitude to tsunamis, oceanic tsunamis. So one of the things I've been doing is studying firsthand in the field the kinds of effects you would see when you might have 500 million cubic feet per second of water volume discharging over the land. And in the aftermath of an event like that, nothing much remains. And I think, going back to your question about what did you call it again?
Devil's Tower.
Yeah, Devil's Tower. Yeah, I don't think it was literally made by the devil, but I've noticed something really kind of interesting in traveling around. So many of the sites that were created by these catastrophic events are called the devil's this, the devil's that, and I've begun to think that maybe the devil did have something to do with it. But, so in my opinion, it's not a tree stump, but that doesn't mean the story that it has to tell is any less interesting.
Have you heard any rumors of LiDAR looking at and scanning the land underneath and its root system underneath Devil's Tower, that monument?
I'm sorry,
Have you heard any rumors about LiDAR technology actually scanning underneath Devil's Tower and finding some chambers?
Underneath the pyramid?
No, under Devil's Tower.
Under Devil's Tower.
Yeah, in Wyoming.
Well, what you're going to see conduits that supplied the magma that upwelled from the mantle, and that's what you're going to see. And it actually could look like a root system.
I see. Okay.
But yeah, there would be openings, conduits. You've got this magma rising under tremendous pressure, and it will push its way up through the rocks, and it will dissolve rocks as it's coming up. And you can look at the lava and discern a lot of information about the subterranean realm, because it'll carry that magma that might be coming from down in the asthenosphere. It might be 20, 30, 40 or more miles below the surface. As it's coming up through the bedrock of the surface, it entrains a lot of that minerals in the rock types that are already there. And so that leaves a chemical signature in the magma that then shows up in the basalt. So you can now identify, and then if an event comes along, like let's say the floods in the Pacific Northwest that washes away huge volumes of basalt bedrock, you might go 50 miles, 100 miles away from the source of that basalt, and by doing a chemical analysis, you can identify it and where it came from.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Randall.
Hey.
Hey, I got a question. What would be the farthest north you could build a, say, megalithic structure before the Younger Dryas in North America?
What about the megalithic structures?
Like when the ice caps were over in North America, and then they were, during the Younger Dryas, when they all melted in catastrophe, before they melted, what's the farthest north you could get and actually be able to build structures?
Well, in North America, glaciologists have documented at least 4 successive glaciations, followed by interglaciations. During the last, what's called the Wisconsin Ice Age in North America, the farthest south it got, it was east of the Mississippi, and that came down pretty close to the Ohio River. So anything that would have been there would have been completely demolished and erased. As you go to the western states, it came down about halfway through Minnesota and Wisconsin. It came, pretty much covered most of North America and part of South America. The Badlands of, I said South America, I meant South Dakota. The Badlands of South Dakota would have been south of the ice sheet because they were created by meltwater erosion, and had the glaciers come that far south, they would have obliterated the Badlands of South Dakota. Then, if you go further west, maybe the upper 50 to 100 miles of Montana, right there just south of the 49th parallel. When you get over to Idaho, if you look at a map and look at Lake Pend Oreille, which is in the northern panhandle of Idaho, that was completely glaciated, and that glacier came down as far south as Spokane, Washington. And if you come all the way to the west, near the west coast, the whole of Puget Sound was under glacial ice. If you go north, interestingly, the ice sort of tapered out just north of the Arctic Circle, and then a big tongue of the glacier ice went over southwestern and southeastern Alaska, and then northern Alaska was not glaciated, and the Bering Land Bridge, which was quite a large tract of land that connected Alaska to Siberia, was not glaciated, and most of Siberia was not glaciated. So if you look at a reconstructed map of the late glacial maximum, and you look at the Arctic Circle, the western hemisphere side of it was glaciated, the eastern hemisphere side was not, which is a rather interesting conundrum.
Thank you.
Okay, that answered your question?
Yeah.
Okay, and as far as the Younger Dryas was an interruption of a more gradual, so at 14,600 is the latest dating, there was a massive event that happened, and it created a huge pulse of meltwater that discharged mostly into the North Atlantic Ocean. And then the climate began to gradually warm, most likely from what are called the Milankovitch cycles, which are changing geometry between the Earth and the Sun. And that was a slow warming that then at 12,000, just after 12,900, was suddenly interrupted by this climatic spasm of return to full glacial cold, a mass extinction of the megafaunal species, the disappearance of the Clovis culture, and it lasted for about 1,300 years. And then at the end of it, around 11,600 years ago, there was another spasm of extreme warming, and it discharged a huge volume of meltwater into the oceans, and that was called Meltwater Pulse 1b. And the date of that is now the date for the beginning of the modern geological epoch called the Holocene. And interestingly, the very date now that meltwater pulse, this huge discharge of meltwater, mostly into the North Atlantic, happened, was exactly the date that Plato gives for the subsidence of Atlantis in his 2 dialogues that happened 9,000 years before Solon's journey to Egypt, where he heard the story of Atlantis from the elderly priests. And I've always considered that to be more than just a coincidence. Because if you're going to have a subsidence of an oceanic landmass, such as a large island or island complex, it would seem to make sense that it would happen when the sea level is rapidly rising, which it did at 11,600 years ago.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Hey, Randall. Hey, Randall. Thank you so much for being here. I was curious to know your thoughts on Petra in Jordan, or if you have any research that you've done on Petra in Jordan.
Not really. I have a couple of friends that have visited there and brought me back and given me some incredible photographs of the place. And I haven't done enough study on it to sit up here and feel qualified to talk about it. But it's certainly on my list.
Yeah, it just seems very interesting that a culture built it and not like, and I don't know. It just
Do you
seems-
know the dating of it?
I unfortunately do not. That's why I was hoping to ask you if anyone
You
knew
were
more
hoping, and
research
I
about it.
just
Yeah.
disappointed you.
No,
I'm sorry.
No, you did not. You did not. I
I'm
appreciate your
deeply
time.
sorry.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Hi there.
Hi.
Well, I had one question, but you mentioned the Bering Straits, so it's going to be two now. The first one is, what do you think once or when the polar ice caps melt, what's that going to do? How's the Earth's magnetism going to be affected by that?
Well, I think that it throws it into disarray for a while. In fact, I think the movement of the magnetic poles might be residual from those events
Right.
between 11 and 14,000 years ago. Because one of the things that happens when you suddenly, in a geological sense, remove literally trillions and trillions of tons of ice, is that the Earth underneath it has been depressed several thousand feet, like under the thickest part of the dome of the ice sheet, which the latest estimates that I've seen puts the thickness of the ice at about 1 3/4 miles over the region of Hudson Bay. But in fact, if somebody is interested, I can show you slides of the isostatic rebound where you can see that Hudson Bay, once it was released from the ice mass, it began to rebound up probably close to 2,000 feet. And you can also see the elevated shorelines. And one of the things that you can see is that the higher shorelines have a greater distance between them because the isostatic uplift was faster in the early period, post-glacial period, and it's been slowing down. So as it slows down, it hasn't risen as much between each successive sea level. But what you do see, though, is because there are successive shorelines, which are called strand lines, what that tells us is because they're discrete and distinct, it almost looks, in fact, it's almost certain then, that the rise of the land was not smooth and uniformly continuous. It was discontinuous. It rose in pulses. So it rose for a while, probably accompanied by seismic activity and earthquakes. It rose, stabilized for long enough time for a shoreline to be etched, and then it rose again and again. And that looks like the model.
Well, that sounds a lot like the Tibetan and the Colorado Plateau, how both of those plateaus have been like substantiated and not eroded for so long. Like there's like a lot of studies that you talked about uneven graduation of the land,
Yeah?
that the Tibetan Plateau is like almost directly under the Colorado Plateau, and those are some of the continuously flat, like not eroded lands in the
Yeah.
US.
The origin of the Colorado Plateau is not easy to explain because you've got within the framework of continental drift, it rose in the strata of Colorado Plateau is mostly level. That's why it's a plateau and not a mountain range. But then the erosion on the Colorado Plateau is extreme. I mean, Grand Canyon is one good example because Grand Canyon is the main discharge point for any water collecting on the plateau itself. And there's, the Colorado River is fed by the Little Colorado, it's fed by the Green River, it's fed by the San Juan River, and several other rivers that all contribute their catchment basins to the plateau. And when you go, I mean, I'm sure most of the people in here have toured the plateau to some extent. There's Grand Canyon, but you go north of here and there's Monument Valley, there's Valley of the Gods, there's Canyonlands, there's Capitol Reef, there's Arches. All of that stuff shows evidence of extreme erosion. And again, the old models, which are not really based on anything, precise evidence, mostly assumptions that it all happened very slowly. I don't think so. I think that I think what we have to look here at the model of earth change that's emerging is one of periods of relatively calm, like we've experienced for the last 10,000 years, and those are interrupted by these short-lived catastrophic episodes in which most of the geological work takes place. And I think when we look up there at the erosion on the Colorado Plateau, that's what we're looking at. And I like to show comparisons between some of the erosional features, the canyons and the mesas and the buttes and things on the plateau, compared to up in the, say, the scablands of eastern Washington, where at this point everybody pretty much in the geological community totally recognizes and acknowledges that those were very short-lived pulses of catastrophic change. So I say, wait a second, if you look at some of the mesas of the Southwest, and then you look at things like Steamboat Rock, and you look same size, same width, same height, but one was eroded in probably a matter of a few weeks, and the other took hundreds of thousands or millions of years. But I don't necessarily think that's the end of the story there.
So my last question was about the Bering Straits, obviously being that big land bridge.
Yeah.
What do you think about a lot of the indigenous elders that say that is not how they got here? What is your take on that?
Well, there was an ice-free corridor, but because you had two great ice sheets over North America. You had the Laurentide, which is the big one, and if you want an analogy, compare it to the Antarctic ice sheet. Then on the western side of the continent, you had the Cordilleran, which was roughly about the size of the ice sheet that covers Greenland. So they both nucleated separately. So the Laurentide, the big one, started by two nucleation centers, one to the east and one to the west of Hudson Bay. Eventually they grew and they coalesced, they expanded, they grew on the eastern margin, they grew right down onto the continental shelf off of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Maine and the whole New England area up there. On the west coast, you had the Cordilleran that was growing over the mountains. It started up in the high valleys of the mountains of the Canadian Rockies, and then it grew out in the zones of accumulation are called cirques, and those cirques expanded and the ice flowed downhill, and then eventually it filled the valleys, and then it got up to about a mile thick, maybe even a little more. And it grew to the east and it grew to the west. As it grew to the east, it eventually met the Laurentide right there on the Rocky Mountain front in Alberta. If you go and draw a line from Edmonton down to Calgary, down into Montana, that was pretty much where the ice-free corridor was. But I think it's very unlikely that there was migration down through that corridor because it would have been an extremely hostile environment between those two great ice sheets. There would have been intense storms, there would have been, marshes and frozen permafrost, and I mean, it would have been a hell of a way to try to traverse a couple thousand miles to get to the southern part of North America. I think it's far more likely that they came in boats, and probably 20 to 30,000 years ago. But, there are still details being discovered that have to be factored into the explanation. But no, pretty much the standard explanation for a long time was the ice-free corridor, and they came down, they migrated through there from Asia, they came across the land bridge, migrated through that ice-free corridor. And I'm not saying it couldn't have happened, it's possible, but it would have been an extremely challenging process, and probably many, many people who tried to migrate down through that corridor would not have made it south of the ice sheet. So, does that answer your question? Kind of? Oh.
Okay, thank you everyone for the patience, and that Q&A was perfect before we get started to let more people get back in. And I just wanted to share a little bit about Randall and our background. I've known Randall since 2019, and we've had him out here speaking 6 times.
Is this number 6?
No, this is actually number 8, but we've had you for 6 speaking engagements, and we had you twice out for the Sacred Geometry course, so that makes 8. And then we did 3 tours with you out here in the Southwest.
Yeah, one of our tours was when we went to Arches, right?
Yeah, that was during COVID.
Oh, yeah. We were defying the authorities.
Yeah.
Well, didn't we try to get in there once, and it was just insanely crowded, and so we went back during COVID and just breezed right in, I think.
Yeah,
Isn't
that's
that what
right.
happened?
That's correct, yeah, yeah. There
And I-
wasn't as many people out there during that time.
And as we're out there in the middle of nowhere, we weren't even wearing masks, were we?
No, we weren't. Everyone was feeling very liberated. Because I remember the first question was, do we have to wear masks? And I go, well, I'm not going to. You can if you want.
Yeah, you're free to wear a mask. Hey, this is America, land of freedom, right?
Exactly, right. The land of freedom.
So yeah, it's true. Robert and I have a history.
And every time we have Randall out, one of the things we do is Randall's going to lead a drum circle. So I wanted to let you all know about that tonight. Afterwards, 9 to 11, Randall's going to lead a drum circle in the lobby.
I'm gonna lead it.
Well, you can lead it, or I imagine you lead it. I imagine everybody else will be imagining you're a leader.
Oh,
So as long as we play in, it should work out just fine.
so did you warn people that
That you're not a leader?
this is gonna be trance drumming?
What? You gotta get into a trance.
It'll put you in a trance.
Okay.
No, some of it actually is. I started studying Middle Eastern trance drumming with a Sufi in 1974. And then 1980, I fell in with some other weird musicians, and we started a band and got notoriously famous, but for a few years, and then it all fell apart. And that's a very long, strange story.
With the Jerry
But
Gar story.
we were doing, we had electric violinist, we had an oud player. Anybody know what an oud is out there? It's the forerunner. It was the forerunner of the lute, which was the forerunner of the guitar. And it's a 10-string fretless instrument. And we had a couple of electric violins and some other stuff. It was a fusion of Middle Eastern trance music, jazz, and rock and roll.
Nice.
It was a hybrid that I've never heard anything like it before or since. So I bet it's out there somewhere, though.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're going to do some drumming. And
Yeah, and the DJ will play some shamanic music. So I just wanted to give you guys that announcement because I forgot to make it earlier today. And the other announcement that I forgot to make earlier today was that there's an after party afterwards at the local apothecary. Is that how you say that? Apotheca, next to Synergy. It's on 89A, and it's right next to Dahl and DeLuca. So 11 to 1, the DJ will go over there, and for those who want to stay up late with Dan Richards, I'm sure he'll be there.
I mentioned Robert. I think you've seen it, but to my knowledge, there's some videos floating around out there of our performances. But I realized when I was loading up here that I actually have a video recording of one of our concerts in 1982 on my laptop.
Oh, okay.
But I dare not play it because I would not be responsible for the consequences. No, actually, I think this audience could handle it.
Yeah, I think they can handle it. Well, those are the two announcements. I'm going to turn it over to Randall so we don't delay him anymore. And everybody, Randall Carlson.
Hey. Well, so I thought I'd start, and I got a bunch of things that we could talk about, but I thought I'd start with the idea of the master builders. I was am still really a third generation master builder. I'll just say builder. I don't think I'll ever qualify as a master builder, not like the builders of the ages, but my father was a builder and carpenter, my grandfather was, so I kind of inherited, and I grew up around construction and building, and my dad probably designed and built about 200 homes, just him and my grandfather. They had Carlson and Son was just the name of their company. And so I was on building sites probably from the age of 7 or 8, 9 years old on, and I had never really planned on getting into construction because I was interested in all this other stuff. I took, I took art classes, and I was interested in science, and I took 2 years of typing, I think, when I was like 9th and 10th grade, because I'm going to write books someday. So, but then I got out of high school in the late 60s and was kind of, wandering around, wondering what to do. The times of the late 60s were very, people, it was very interesting. I know a lot of you were probably around then, it was just like, it was almost like there was just a stream of consciousness that was manifesting as people, primarily young people, just exploring all over the country. I mean, for example, hitchhiked thousands of miles around America, exploring and, visiting various communities. And, I got into about 20, 21, and I thought, I'm ready to settle down. I've been on the road for like 3 years, and I decided I need to do something legal for a change. And so I thought, well, I've got some carpentry skills, so I started getting into it. And the more I got into it, the more this is really fun. I like being outside. It requires some thought. It's not just like the whole craft of carpentry has gotten way dumbed down since like the days of my dad and my grandfather. But I was also interested in spiritual pursuits, and so I ended up following a Himalayan Swami and a Brahmin priest. And I studied with them for a couple of years, and it culminated in a retreat in the North Woods of Minnesota. And in this group, studying this yoga and meditation, there was an architect, and he was very much influenced by Buckminster Fuller. How many of you know Buckminster Fuller? Yeah, good, most of you. So and you remember probably Buckminster Fuller domes, the geodesic domes that were very popular back then until everybody realized it's almost impossible to keep them from leaking. Of course, they're much better now, my understanding is because of the new technologies and stuff. But anyways, so we bought this land up in northern Minnesota, and we decided we were going to hold a retreat up there. And so this architect designs a couple of domes. One of them was just a 3/5 geodesic Buckminster Fuller dome, and the other one was a 5/8 dome with a spire on the top that was inspired by an Islamic mosque architecture. So myself and my 2 younger brothers sort of got drafted to be lead carpenters on this thing, and I remember having to figure out and calculate the geometry of how to integrate the struts and the angles that you had to cut to fit them all together, because everything was pre-cut. And I thought, this is really cool, this is fun, because you had to think things through. It was challenging. So we built these 2 domes, and then the one which was called the Bindu dome, because the Bindu was the point of the ultimate singularity, the point of light from which all creation emanated. And that was the symbolism here, because the top of the dome converged into this point. So then it was an unusual structure, and then a year later, in 1973, it came out, this large format book came out, like literally like this big, and it was called Shelter. And in this book, Shelter, the theme of the book was how architecture was the interface between humans and the environment. So they covered everything from yurts up to Gothic cathedrals to Greek temples, everything in between. And that was the very first. So when that book was published, important point, they featured this dome that we built. It was a featured project, the Bindu Dome. So it had a whole page, and it had some nice big photographs in there. And it was my little brother, who's still my partner in business, and he was, I think, 17 years old at the time, and he's up there lead carpenter, and he's got his tool belt on. And so I had to buy the book. I did. And then as I started getting into it, I started realizing, God, this is amazing thing here. They described, the design of a Gothic vault. It was the first place I had ever heard of the divine proportion. They talked about that in the book and how it had been used by different cultures in art and architecture and so on, but mostly architecture. And I just got so fascinated, I launched a study that's still going on today. I'm still learning more things about the geometry. But I got really interested in this whole legacy of of this architecture. And as I got more into it, as the years went by in the 70s, I discovered in my readings the references to the Freemasons who built the great Gothic cathedrals. And I got very interested in that and realized that as I studied the history, well, they had this legacy of this knowledge, this incredible knowledge, because a Gothic vault is very different from all the architecture that came before it. It's actually under tension, and I wish I had a ruler with me now because I usually use a piece of wood to show what the effects of tension are compared to simple compression. Like all your earlier Romanesque architecture was mostly compression, which is just, it's like this. Tension is like this, see? So if you just think of an instrument. Obviously, if you're going to play a stringed instrument, those strings have to be under tension, right? Or they don't vibrate with any kind of a discernible frequency. They're just dead. Well, the vault of the ogival vault, it's called in a Gothic cathedral, is under tension. And as I learned more about it, I learned that the mortar that they used was as strong as the rock itself, so that the whole vault could act as a unified structural system. And the reason I like to have a piece of flexible wood or metal is that if you take it and you bend it like this, if you can visualize, you're bending it like this, it's under tension. And if you let it go, like at the bottom, it springs up. And this is the forces that manifest in a Gothic vault are wanting to do that. And that's, if you look at the outer structure, well, you can't see it on this, but you will see it in subsequent slides. The flying buttress comes up, and it literally is there to hold this. They call it, in fact, the spring point, the point where the arch wants to spring up like this. And if you look at the pillars that hold it, there are literally almost spacings that are like the frets on a guitar. And as I learned about it, I realized, well, this is a musical instrument. And it is. It's a musical instrument. And and within the chamber, the idea is when the chants and so forth are being recited in the chambers, there's a type of resonance that happens in this chamber. And it's not only the acoustic properties, it's also the properties of light, because if you compare pictures of an old Romanesque church, it's very dark, the columns are extremely heavy, windows are very small. You look at a Gothic, it's open, it's light, and they've filled these expanses of open space with these incredible stained glass windows. And then as I learned more about it, I go, some of these cathedrals, it took 150 years to build, and you would have multiple generations of families, for example, might be working on one stained glass window. Or you look at the sculptural programs, which are just these incredible detailed sculptures. And we don't know we don't know at all. Who were the artisans who did this? It was a mystery. And I just really had to find out more about that. And every time the more I read, the name Freemasons kept coming up and coming up. Well, the Freemasons, they're an organization, they exist today, right? Are these the same Freemasons that were designing and building these Gothic cathedrals? Well, I didn't know the answer to that back then, but I decided that I wanted to find out. And I just, around that time, 1978, we're at now, I met a Freemason and I asked him about this. I said, he said, well, these are things you need to join the craft. And I said, well, how do I join the craft? And he said, well, this is how you do it. You ask, how do I join the craft? That's how it starts. I said, okay, well, I'd like to. And he said, well, you got to have 2 Masons in good standing who are going to vouch for you and sign your petition. You have to fill out a petition, submit it, and you have to have 2 Masons in good standing. He said, I can introduce you to a Masonic friend of mine, which he then did. And it turned out that this Masonic friend was writing a book on catastrophism and the Great Pyramid, and potentially the Great Pyramid. So I befriended him, got to know him. He's long gone now, but so that sort of started, these 2 things started weaving in together. But he signed my petition. I eventually, entered the craft. I think I met those guys in 77 because I joined the craft in 78. And I went in there and I realized that there was just this tremendous treasure trove of knowledge sitting like this big treasure chest full of riches of knowledge, and nobody was really paying attention to it. You know, it was all good brothers, and they were there for the fellowship and for the charity and this and that, but only a few of them were really interested in what it was really about, which was the mysteries. And that's where I came in, and I wanted to know more about that. So I just started studying more and more, and it's only in recent few decades that enough evidence has emerged to show that it was almost certainly a continuity between the modern organization of Freemasonry and the guys who built that right there, right? But that was not really known back, because it went back and it sort of petered out in the 1600s. Well, there was a reason for that, because for one thing, for a number of centuries, Freemasonry was suppressed. It was outlawed. And so a lot of the critics say, oh, well, it's a secret society. Well, they were able to preserve the secrets of these building techniques and the sacred geometry upon which they were based because they were secret. If they hadn't been secret, it wouldn't have existed anymore, and we wouldn't have the legacy of sacred geometry that we now have. So when I did my first sacred geometry lecture, it was 1979. And one of my neighbors was an architect from India. And we would talk, and I would explain to him some of the stuff I was studying. And he said, hey, I have a bunch of architect friends. Would you consider giving us a talk about your studies and research? So he organized this right in his living room. There was maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8 architects in there, and I went in there and I presented this research. I put together a slideshow in the old-fashioned slides, slide projectors, if you remember those. And it was very well received. And that was the very first lecture I ever did on the subject. And that just led to more and more, and it, you know, I moved into sort of the Bohemian section of Atlanta in 1980, and there was a little business that had just opened up there. It was called the Daily Planets Astrology Center. And I went by there one day and was talking to him, and I said, yeah, he said, you ever had your horoscope done? I said, no, I haven't. I'd like that. Let's do that. So they did that. We kind of got to know each other, and then the 2 partners that opened the thing said, we want to start holding some classes here. And in our discussions, I had talked about this kind of thing. I'd talked about sacred geometry and the legacy of sacred building and all of that. I said, would you like to do a class? And I said, well, I'll give it a shot. I'll try it. And he said, oh, and by the way, we'll pay you. So I said, yeah, sign me up. Because at that point, I was pretty much still what I would call a hippie carpenter with a pickup truck with tools in the back. And I was very freelance and all of that. And so I said, sure. And I started, and I ended up, I think, doing it about 2 years there. And then one thing kind of led to another. And before I knew it, I was getting, you know, requests to come to this group or that group and present information. And meanwhile, I'm building things. And then my younger brother shows up in Atlanta, and I was getting calls for projects that were way beyond the scale of a hippie carpenter with a pickup truck. So he came here and we said, well, you know, we're having to turn down this work because it's, you know, it's too big. And he says, why don't we go legit, you know, form a real company and get some other employees and take on some of these bigger jobs. So we did that. And I had spent maybe 12, 13 years, we were perfecting the carpentry skills that I had. And I was, by this time, a pretty damn good carpenter. But then we launched our business and then realized that it took another decade to figure out how to be in business. And that first effort didn't end up so good. We did some amazing jobs, but we never made any money. That was the problem. So we kind of let that whole organization go. We went back to a year or 2 of being hippie carpenters. And then I got a friend of mine that had how many of you have heard of the Waldorf School or know the work of Rudolf Steiner? Okay, so there was a a Waldorf school in Atlanta that only went up to the 8th grade. Now, if you know the system in the Waldorf school, it starts at 1st grade and you have the same teacher for up like into the middle school, and it only went to the 8th grade. And this friend of mine, Bradley, I run into him, so he says, you still doing this geometry stuff? I said, yeah, I'm still doing that. And he said, well, would you consider coming? I've been recruited by a group of parents whose students, whose children have graduated from the 8th grade, and they don't want to go to public school. So we've organized a homeschooling organization, and we've rented a couple of rooms in a local church and turned them into classrooms. Would you come and do like 4 classes over 2 weeks to these kids about geometry? And you know, I had enough time then because we were sort of between actually different companies. And then I said, sure, I'll do that. So I went in there, and this was March of 1995. I think it was March of 1995. And I went in and I did 2 classes 1 week for like 2 hours each, and then 2 the next week. Right? And it was fun. Yeah, like, you know, maybe call me next year or whatever. Well, a couple of days went by, and Bradley calls me. He says, hey, the kids want to know if you'll come back. And I said, oh, really? Okay, sure, I'll come back. And so what I did, like I still do, I combine art with math, with geometry. And so I had these kids drawing and coloring. So they'd never studied or learned math like that before. So I went back and I did another 2 weeks, and then that ended up. And then, sure enough, Bradley calls again. Hey, the kids want to know, they want to keep going. So I ended up finishing out the whole year with them. And then summer break came, and over the summer I started getting phone calls from parents, some in the Waldorf system, others not. I ended up organizing geometry courses and classes for the next 15 years for homeschool kids. And I had, I don't know, 120 to 150 kids that I taught geometry to. And going through that and doing that, I began to really think about education and how children learn and how to engage children. And I came up with some ideas of my own about that from this hands-on process that I'd been in for 15 years now. Well, what happened was, after the first year, I get this call for this project that I knew was going to be very profitable. Now, it's still just me and my brother, and we have one helper between us. And it was somebody we knew. It would have been a really cool job, and we would, it could have been very profitable. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to have to, this was after one year, I think, only 1 year of the teaching. And I said to the mother of one of the students, her name was Jane, I said, Jane, I'm not going to be able to, I'm probably going to have to stop tutoring because I'm going to have my hands full with this new project that we're doing. And she says, oh, you can't do that. You have to keep, listen, she says, I'm married to a carpenter from Bulgaria, and he needs a job. And, oh, okay, Bulgaria, I didn't know much about Bulgaria, but, so she said, can I introduce you? And he's got a friend, and the two of them need a job, and they're both carpenters. And I said, well, let me talk to them then. So I met those 2 guys, and I hired them, and they turned out to be incredible. In fact, one of them is still with me now. We still work together, and he's just an awesome dude. Well, this was short, because of Desert Storm, the government had opened up and liberalized the immigration quotas from Bulgaria. So I had this pipeline of these Bulgarians, and within a couple of years, I had 20 Bulgarians working for me. And we started doing these incredible projects, high-end, like Frank Lloyd Wright design type houses. We did restaurants. We did all kinds of stuff. And then when the real estate market collapsed between 2009 and 2011, we went for a year. We had 2 great projects lined up based on the equity value of the owner's properties, and the equity evaporated, and so did the potential contract. So we found ourselves right back with only me and my brother and one helper between us. And going from prosperity to poverty, and that was very stressful. But what then happened was that I had a lot of free time that I hadn't had before. So it was at that point that I made my first effort at launching a website and revamping classes and courses and lectures and so on. And so that kind of was the last phase that's kind of led up to this. As a result of I got called and I did a lecture, I did a presentation at a Dragon Con, I think it was 2010. And Graham Hancock was there. And we found ourselves on a panel together with about 3 or 4 other people on the panel, and a lot of the folks on the other people on this panel were saying stuff. Then I noticed Graham kept looking at me, and I'd look at Graham like, Graham was like, that's nuts, you know. So at the end of it, we kind of realized we kind of had this meeting of the minds, and we connected and became friends at that point. And then Graham went on Joe Rogan, and they're talking about all of this stuff, and I think this is 2016, and then Graham tells Joe that, yeah, you need to get this guy Randall Carlson on there. So not long later, I get a call from Joe's producer, and he says, Joe would like to get you on the show. And I knew who he was, you know, because, in fact, I had remembered him from one of these sitcoms that he started out on. I don't remember the name of it. But so I went on there. It turned out to be one of his most popular podcasts. So I ended up going back. I've been on his show 8 times now. Now, of course, from that point on, it sort of began to mushroom. And I don't know if that probably had some connection with how I met Robert. But anyways, now I'm about to hit, I think, 700,000 subscribers. When I started, I had 25. So I thought, well, God, maybe I can get 1,000. That was what I was thinking. And now it's just kind of gone crazy. And I'm like, I'm supposed to, you know, wait a minute, wasn't 10 years ago, wasn't I thinking like 15 years ago that by now I'd be retired, I'd be a reclusive scholar? Well, it hasn't quite turned out the way I imagined. But anyways, it's super great to be here. I've left out a few of the salacious details, but there's been many exciting things that have happened along the way. I will mention, because of this love of geology, you know, I met Brad Young. If you've remembered the Cosmographia podcast, ever watched that? He's my good buddy. We were at a conference together. This is probably 2000. Well, let's see. Was it 90s? I don't remember. A long time though, and we both liked to travel and have adventures, and so he and I started. We'd recruit a couple of our buddies, and we'd just start going on these recon trips all over the place. I went to Central America, I went to Europe, I went to Egypt, we explored all over the United States, we went up into Canada, and, we would document this along the way. And then when we were in Canada one year, I was going up to, in fact, we were talking about the ice-free corridor. Interestingly, in the ice-free corridor, there's this selection of huge mega quartzite boulders. The biggest one is called Okotoks, which is Blackfoot language for big rock. And Big Rock is just south of Calgary. And there's this train, it's over 500 miles long, of these huge mega quartzite boulders. And it was there, they exactly defined right where the ice-free corridor would have been. And I wanted to know more about this, and so we went up there one year. I think this was 1999. We went up there and traveled up, and by this time I had learned that these metaquartzite boulders, which are in this long train all the way down to Montana, the bizarre part of it was that here you have an 18,000-ton boulder, and it's sitting on the Rocky Mountain front in Alberta on the eastern side of the Continental Divide. But the rock source was on the western side of the Continental Divide. So, when you studied the rocks, it became obvious that they could not be transported by the glaciers themselves, because you've got a 200 to 300 mile journey for some of these rocks. Well, at the rate a glacier flows, it's going to be subjected to continuous snowfall and buildup of glacier ice. So you're going to have hundreds of feet, maybe 1,000 feet of glacial ice burying these rocks. Now, if you know anything about glaciers, you know that the movement of temperate glaciers is very dynamic, and the forces, it's just not a smooth, continuous. There's lots of stresses moving throughout the glacial ice. And what would have happened is these boulders would have been crushed. But here they are sitting in a pristine condition out in the prairie with sharp angular corners, and the Okotoks rock is actually 3 big rocks that were all part of the same rock. But so then the question is, how did they get there? Well, here's how they got there. They were transported on gigantic icebergs. And those gigantic icebergs were being floated and carried along in a gigantic flood of meltwater. And when that flood drained down and finally the water subsided, these icebergs, some of them the size of tanker ships, came to ground in that region, which is what we call the ice-free corridor. Then over subsequent years, it would have taken for these giant icebergs to melt, but on top of these icebergs were these gigantic boulders. Then the icebergs melted away, the boulders came down and were gently placed onto the prairie. But we can tell that the ground of the prairie was soft. And how do we know that? Because a lot of these rocks sank into the ground. And what you're seeing above ground might only be half the rock or 2/3 of the rock, and the rest of it's underground, right? So now we have this scenario that just doesn't really make sense. How do you get an 18,000-ton boulder on the west side of the Continental Divide, cross the Continental Divide, and bring it, transport it 200, 250 miles, set the thing in pristine condition down right in the prairie? Well, first of all, you have to have a mechanism to excavate, if you will, to quarry those gigantic boulders. They then have to be loaded onto the glacial ice, because these icebergs were glacial ice. You have to load them onto the glacial ice, and then at the same time you have to provide enough meltwater to float these gigantic icebergs, carrying them across the Continental Divide down 200, 300 miles and dump them on the prairie. And then the water that continued on came down and it carved what is now the Missouri River Valley, which was carved catastrophically by the same floods. Those floods flowed in and met the Mississippi River, where in the region now where St. Louis is. And if we look at Google Earth maps, you can see that south of St. Louis, if you draw a latitudinal line from, say, Memphis over to Little Rock, that flood right there was about 100 miles wide, where the Mississippi River is now. And it was being fed from multiple sources. So that to me was like a huge eye-opening. But the thing is that what was the initial force that could have created this whole flood? You've got to simultaneously fracture huge amounts of glacial ice, you have to melt huge amounts of glacial ice, and you have to quarry and shovel onto these ice these gigantic boulders. Well, clearly it was you could only explain it by a catastrophe. And something had to carry these icebergs over the Continental Divide. And so that led me, along with, what have I done now, 20, 25 trips out in the West exploring, and the entire western United States bears imprints of gigantic catastrophic floods. Some of the biggest ones came out of Canada, because that melting phenomena that occurred was so far beyond, the energies released during those episodes were so far beyond anything we've experienced in the last 10,000 years that we're literally talking about orders of magnitude in terms of the energy released during these events. Okay, so now we understand and realize that what happened back then during the end of the last ice age was only the most recent of a grand, vast cycle of catastrophes that have affected this planet repeatedly, and repeatedly since we humans have lived on the planet. Our ancestors somehow successfully coped with catastrophes that are almost inconceivable in their scale. And how did they do it? I don't exactly know yet. But they did it because if they didn't successfully survive these events, we wouldn't be here now, okay? Well, as I began to learn more about what the implications were to the ecosystem of the planet, to the biosphere, this is when I began to realize literally the concept of the wasteland. The wasteland was a byproduct of these catastrophes. Then I began, and here's where I think the pieces start coming together. I began to realize and understand that there was a lost science that had somehow been preserved across some of these catastrophes. And how was it preserved? Well, it was preserved in multiple different ways, because if you're trying to maximize the probabilities that some body of knowledge is going to get preserved, you come up with multiple diverse ways to encode that knowledge and see that it gets propagated through the centuries and through the generations, and that's what was done. So it's come down to us in multiple different ways. I mentioned Freemasonry, that was one of the ways. But here's the connection between that and what we're talking about here. Because if we look over the whole planet, we now know that this sacred building science was practiced in many different forms, by many different cultures, over many different ages, repeatedly around the planet. What was their motive? Why quarry 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-ton rocks? Why move billions of tons of earth and create these elaborate earthwork structures like we see in North America? By the way, the lost civilization of North America, it's one of the things I do talk about now and have researched pretty extensively. South America, Central America, Egypt, Greece, Northern Europe, Indochina, doesn't matter. We look at these, and if you look at Angkor Wat, doesn't look anything like Stonehenge, right? Doesn't look anything like the monumental earthworks of the Mississippi Valley. Doesn't look like any of the stepped pyramids of ancient Sumeria or the stepped pyramids in Central America that we see. Yet underlying all of these outer expressions, there's a common template. And that's what I'm going to talk about here, is that common template, because what they were doing, which I now understand, is that they were practicing a science, a technology of regenerating the earth in the aftermath of a catastrophe. And this was what launched this science, and this is what motivated our ancestors to do this, because they knew that literally there were energies of the earth and energies of the sky that were involved in these catastrophes. And that in the aftermath of these catastrophes, the energies of the earth, whether you want to talk about the geomagnetic field or something more subtle than that, were completely disrupted. And balance had to be restored to the system, to the planetary system. And when you look at all of the components of the ancient building, the sacred building, this is what you begin to see over and over again in the pattern. And so let's look at some of that. And I'm going to stand up here because, darn, this stool is tarred. And we don't want a catastrophe up here on stage. So a few quotes to begin our discussion here. Through wisdom is a house builded, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. And they are. The chambers are built, are preserved, precious. Remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set. Why not? Why? Because if it's all removed, we're not going to go out and wonder at the presence of a 20-ton stones or billions of tons of earth that have been moved. Without that presence, now so much of it has been lost, but because enough of it still exists that we're here, wondering about it, thinking about it, asking about it, which is precisely what we're supposed to be doing, because it's a legacy, and we've inherited that legacy, and it's a vast book. And there's two great vast books. One is that, see, we're in this privileged position now because even a few generations ago, we didn't have the diverse knowledge base that we have now that allows us to integrate and connect these dots and see these similarities, right? That it's all part of one system. And that one system has been practiced over the whole world, and from time to time we can go back to 5,000 years, and much longer than that. The work now that's just come out by Alberto Donini, the Italian engineer, we can maybe get into that if we have some time, or maybe I could do a bonus presentation tomorrow. He's used the relative erosion method to study the erosion on the base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. And he's concluded that it's probably at least 25,000 years old. And I've studied deeply into rock erosion, particularly limestone erosion, and I think his work is robust, and it's probably right on. And it's consistent with work like on the Sphinx that suggests that the Sphinx is much older. Robert Schoch, I'm sure you all know his work well. But there's a lot more now we're finding out. Göbekli Tepe and others, we're finding out more and more that there are remnants of prehistoric structures that were built by people who were obviously highly motivated. And that to me was one of the things that seems mainstream well, it was a ceremonial purpose or it was a religious purpose, but it never goes beyond that. Well, what about this? Maybe it was a scientific purpose. Maybe what we're seeing when we look at all these remnants scattered around the world are the pieces and the parts, the remains of an ancient technology that was employed for the purpose of restoring the earth under various conditions of extreme catastrophe. And when you begin to think in that context, yes, now that doesn't in any way to say technology. People, technology, and they start immediately thinking machines, and but I think it was all spiritual, a spiritual purpose. And I say, absolutely it was a spiritual purpose. Because what we're understanding now is that the universe is made up of degrees of energy and matter in various states of condensation, of solidity. We're physical beings, but we're also beings of plasma, of subtle energy. And what we're now learning about plasma, I think, was the missing piece. That there are forces of plasma that it's 99% of all matter in the universe. And I think that we're sort of in a position now, perhaps even realizing that we can scientifically demonstrate the existence of the soul. And it may be connected directly with some of the subtle properties and characteristics of plasma, which in very curious ways seems to generate coherent structures. And one of the things that I've learned only within the last 5 to 10 years is that there are certain frequencies that cause plasma to spontaneously cohere into geometric forms. And those geometric forms are oftentimes reproductions of what we're learning from sacred geometry, and the frequencies, the numbers of those frequencies are the numbers, the sacred cosmological numbers that we've inherited from thousands of years ago. They appear in the Bible, they appear in the Vedas, they appear in the Mayan traditions over and over again, the same numbers. They appear in the Sumerian king lists, numerous places. We find those embedded in the sacred architecture all over the world. I can show you that the same geometry patterns that are underlying Angkor Wat underlie the great monumental earthworks of the Mississippi Valley. They were working from the same tradition, oftentimes at the same time, right? So here you have this principle now that frequency can cause plasma to spontaneously self-organize into these coherent systems. And in some of the respects now, what scientists who are looking at this are discovering is that they exist traits of living things and intelligence. If you'd like to, I'll recommend a book by Robert Temple. Maybe some of you have read it. A New Science of the Heavens. A New Science of the Heavens. And he gets into talking in there about the connection of how plasma physics and our understanding of plasma may be reconnecting us with some of the great spiritual traditions of humankind on this planet. But it goes more than that, because I think that the master builders of old understood using frequencies to perhaps quarry and move. We heard some of the stuff today. The Vajra, how many of you know what the Vajra is? The supreme instrument of cosmic power that was wielded by Indra, the god Indra. I met somebody today whose name is Indra. Yeah, are you here, Indra? All right. Awesome, man. The Vajra, wielded by the god Indra, and it passed from India into Persia and became the instrument wielded by Mitra. And from there it passed through Zoroastrianism, eventually made its way to Greece and Rome. And we see Zeus wielding the thunderbolt, which is just that version, that cultural version of the Vajra. And it made its way to Rome and became the instrument wielded by Mithras. Let's see, are you here? I've been talking, yeah. He and I have had some very interesting conversations. He's been studying into the Mithraic tradition. The Mithraic tradition is an incredible repository of symbolism. It was the prime competitor to early Christianity. For some reason it lost out, but the whole Mithraic tradition is just suffused with this incredibly rich symbolism. And I think at the core of this is this idea of the Vajra, the idea of the thunderbolt. And there is now testing going around in laboratories and in garages of backyard mechanics, testing devices that are concentrating and using coherent plasmas, and the results are quite outstanding. And if anybody wants to, I would recommend going to a site called Alchemical Science, if you want to learn more, run by Jordan Collin out of Australia. And he has put together a whole series of videos where he's describing at least one manifestation of and application of plasma and plasma-based technology. And read Robert Temple's book. Robert Temple, you may remember, was the man who wrote the Sirius Mystery back in the 80s. Remember that? So let's go on. Famous quote by Arthur C. Clarke. This is a great quote by Victor Hugo. From the most immemorial temple of Hindustan to the Cathedral of Cologne, architecture has been the great manuscript of the human race. This is true to such a degree that not only every religious symbol, but every human thought has its page and its memorial in that vast book. And if Victor even comprehended that it way beyond the scale that he was imagining. So let's talk about the ancient guilds of initiated master builders and craftsmen. So John Michel, one of my favorite researchers and authors, how many of you ever read John Michel? A few of them. I can't recommend John high enough. He did work on ancient architecture, on sacred geometry, on the links between those and Kabbalistic systems and esoterica. Really rich stuff. I discovered his work in the early 70s, 73, 74, and was blown away by it. It really had changed my life as I came to understand these interconnections of these diverse things that I had been. And he was where I first really came to understand the system of cosmological numbers and how they're hidden in so many different ways around us. He showed how in many passages of the Bible, even like in the Greek New Testament, in the Hebrew Old Testament, that there was a system. I kind of was vaguely aware of this, but never had really studied to the point where I had realized that the real depth of meaning of these books is hidden under the stories and the literary outer expression. But if you understand that in the Semitic languages, prior to the advent of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, when You had numerals on one hand and letters of the alphabet on the other. Prior to that, they were the same system. So in the Greeks, in the times of Greek, the same letters, if it was alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, etc., they were not only letters, they were also numbers. Same with the Hebrew. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Chet, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, they were all numbers as well as letters. So what that means is that if you go into the sacred writings, and it's not just limited to the Old or New Testament, many of the apocryphal texts are really rich in this system. But it's this, if you go in and you take the names and the phrases and the key words, you substitute in the numerical values for the names and the phrases and so on, what do you discover? That there's a whole level of mathematics. And this is the mathematics that I think these guys knew about and were using, because over and over again, you get these reiterative numbers. They emerge repeatedly as you substitute. And then, of course, they're the same numbers. They're the same numbers that are the frequencies that cause plasma energies to cohere into organized systems. And that's what's under the stories of the New Testament and the Old Testament. And under the Vedic system, we find the same numbers in the Vedic system that are in the Bible. And Christianity, the main religion of America, in fact, the West, and almost nobody knows that underneath the literary cover, you peel it back, and there's a whole nother level of geometry and mathematics. But it's there, and it confirms independently from multiple other venues of knowledge. And what this is telling us, I think, is that we're in this position now, a very privileged position, because a few generations ago, it was not possible to connect these dots. And I'm pretty excited now because I've started, I now, of those 700,000 subscribers, are people from all over the world. So I think what's happening now is there's a community of people that have realized there's more to this story of our presence on this planet than we had ever even begun to imagine. And it's beginning to reveal itself to us now. And as we begin to understand the big picture, we're going to be able to, without understanding the big picture, we're not going to be able to chart our way into the future. But I think we right now stand at a crossroads. And where the future of humanity goes, which direction, depends on what we hear, what we do here now, and what the young generations coming up, what they do here now. And I'm optimistic, but it's going to be very challenging because there are forces that want to keep us in the dark, want to keep us enslaved to authoritarian systems, that want to suppress free speech and free thought. But I'm thinking, one of the things everybody here has in common is we're all free thinkers. We're all open. We're all curious. We all know instinctively there's more to the story. And so I think we've got a huge challenge in front of us. We've got a tremendous responsibility to do what we need to do to preserve this knowledge and perpetuate this knowledge, just like ancestors of ours before have done, sometimes at great cost to themselves. Think of Giordano Bruno. Think of Jacques de Molay. Think of many others that were imprisoned, were tortured, were burned at the stake for the crime of being free thinkers, for perpetuating ideas outside the acceptable boundaries of thought. The iconoclasts, those who dared to question the prevailing narratives of the time. But I think it's to the point now where it's getting harder and harder for the forces of darkness to keep the truth from emerging. And we discovered that there's so much, that the human story on this planet is so much deeper and so much more complex than we were taught in school. We were taught in our religious institutions. And I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be alive. In fact, I wish every chair in this auditorium was filled. But it's going to happen, I think, because the forces of darkness are pushing us to the point where many people are going, okay, this is not the route we want to go down. We do not want a world of perpetual war and conflict based upon contrived narratives. We don't want that, and we don't need that. And I don't think we're going to have it, because so let's get into a little bit here the parameters of sacred architecture. So these are the things that we find in common in all of the sacred architecture through the ages and around the world. First, symbol, encoding of the mythical and archetypal meaning. That kind of comes number one. There's a symbolical meaning or expression, and the whole process then follows from that. The next thing is the number and measure, which gives us the modulus of the plan. Every plan, whether it's a truncated pyramid up in the Ohio River Valley or in Central America, or some of the stuff that you saw here today from some of these amazing speakers, or in Egypt or in Greek, there is a number and a measure that unites these things. And each of these structures, these sacred structures and monuments, they're unique. Like I say, there's a unifying template, but they're unique in the sense that if you build something in Egypt with the forces of nature there, the latitude, and dependent upon the latitude and longitude, is going to determine its unique relation to the heavens. That's all taken into account. So each place has its own unique number and its own unique measure. So I like to show people how you can look at, for example, Greek temples or Gothic cathedrals and see that there is a relationship between the placing of them on the earth, the size of them, the proportions of them, and its position on the earth relative to its latitude, which determines its relationship to the sun, to the moon, the plane of the ecliptic, and the stars. The orientation, the cosmic and astronomical alignments. The siting, which I refer to as sacred geography, association with geological and geomantic structures and patterns. Because the energies within the landscape of this planet are very unique. And the geomagnetic field is one expression of that. And the work, how many of you know the work of Paul Devereux? The English researcher who wrote in the 1980s, he did these geomantic surveys, mainly around the British Isles, but also Northern Europe. And he discovered that they weren't just placed randomly on the landscape. They were placed relative to the underlying geological structure. And more often than not, they were aligned along fault lines. Now, why fault lines? Fault lines are like cracks in the earth, but they're not just static cracks or fractures. A fault line is a fracture in the earth, but unlike a normal, just a crack, fault lines move with respect to each other. And that creates dynamic force fields. And it is also allows for the passage of water. And that water is moving through the fault lines under pressure. You know, there's as much water in the mantle of the earth, in the lithosphere of the earth, as there is in the oceans. Now, in the oceans, we all know that the waters of the oceans can be dramatically affected by the moon. We've all seen the tides, and we know that there's this connection, well-verified connection between the motions of the moons and the tides of the seas. Well, likewise, there are tides of water within the structure, within the substructure of the earth, in the lithosphere. And that movement of water, which is being moved through the rocky lithosphere under pressure, is also being affected by tidal forces. And that creates patterns of energy, fluctuations and anomalies in the geomagnetic fields. But I think it goes much deeper than that, because I think ultimately what's being affected is the plasma sheath of the earth itself. How many of you are familiar with the work of Wilhelm Reich? Some of you, yes. He was I think somebody mentioned him in one of the, yes, right. So Wilhelm Reich discovered what he called the orgone energy. And he built devices, chambers, which were based upon layering of organic and inorganic material. And when he had the materials arranged in the precise manner, he discovered that it accumulated a type of subtle energy in its inner chamber, right? And that energy had healing properties. And what's your name again? Harvey, yeah, Harvey. So Harvey was talking about this when he came up to the microphone last night, and he was mentioning how one of the two things, I don't know if you mentioned the orgone accumulator, but you did mention the cloudbuster, right? So cloudbuster was an invention of Wilhelm's, and he discovered that he could gently massage the atmosphere, and he could break droughts. He could bring rain, not by, seeding with silver dioxide, silver oxides, but by this gentle massaging of the atmosphere. And he was treating people with cancer. He had about 200 cancer patients, and I'm trying to remember how he got in trouble initially with the FDA, but it's somewhere the FDA got wind that he was using unorthodox methods to treat patients of cancer. So, there was an individual involved who targeted him. I don't remember the man's name, but he decided that he wanted to destroy Wilhelm Reich. And so he, I think, was the one who reported him. Do you remember Harvey?
Yeah, I don't remember the guy's name, but he was working with the FDA.
Yeah.
He was a communist, too.
He was what? He was a communist, and we know that communism is about strict authoritarianism, right? Anyways, so the FDA came down, and what they wanted to do was they wanted to build a fraud case against him. So they started going around to all of the patients that he was treating that had basically been given up by traditional medicine and said, we would like to enlist you as a plaintiff in a fraud case against Wilhelm Reich. They couldn't get anybody. The response was, well, I would be dead now if it wasn't for his treatment. So what they finally did was and if I leave out an important detail or I miss it, let me know, Harvey. What they then did was gave him an order to cease and desist, which he then wrote a letter to the circuit court and said he wanted to be judged not by a bunch of bureaucrats, but by his scientific peers. And they then declared that was contempt of court, which gave the FDA the license to come out and destroy his laboratory. They went in there with sledgehammers and smashed all of his equipment and loaded like 2 truckloads of his notes and papers and things to an incinerator and burned them. And they took Wilhelm and put him in federal prison. And there is a book written by, Harvey, did you ever read the Book of Dreams by Peter, his son? Yeah. You remember his son talks about how the day before he was to be released, he went in to visit his father, and his father said, they're not going to let me out alive. And the next day, when he was due to be released, he was found dead in his cell. And that setback, there was some doctors, other doctors that said his work with the orgone energy could be the greatest medical breakthrough of our time. So even back then in the 1950s, it was 1957, wasn't it? 57, yeah. That was a tremendous loss. However, I think enough of his work survived that we can see it has direct implications for the things we're learning now. And I think that what he was doing, what he called the orgone energy, and you mentioned, Harvey, how it had correlations amongst many, prana, every healing tradition, right, every healing tradition. And his work with the cloudbuster. I just left Georgia, and we finally had like a 2-month drought that broke. I mean, trees were drying up, and then we had this great rain just the day before I left. But he had discovered how he could break droughts, make rainfall, and Harvey, I guess you know some of the stories, the anecdotal stories that were eyewitnesses to some of the stuff. He even learned how to turn hurricanes and dissolve hurricanes before they could make landfall. It's hard to even imagine what we lost. Yeah, that's awesome. So Harvey is just telling me that his work has been preserved? Yeah, and I know somebody, I didn't know him, I know his widow up in North Georgia, Christopher Bird. Are you familiar with Christopher Bird? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So he wrote with Peter Tompkins, The Secret Life of Plants and others. So she has a collection of Christopher Bird's work, which is extensive on Wilhelm Reich. Anyways, let's keep going here. So we have siting, sacred geometry, association with geological and geomantic structures and patterns, and then the sacred geometry, harmonic design, form, pattern, and dynamic symmetry, and finally alchemy, which is the preparation and processing of the raw materials. Now, Harvey, you're probably aware of this. In the building of the monumental earthworks and mounds, there's layering of organic and inorganic materials. Exactly the kind of structure that Wilhelm discovered in his building of the orgone accumulator.
Especially in the American Native American mounds, they always have like sand and shell and sand.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, the Native American mounds. And we are probably going to be organizing some trips. I've tried to visit every moderately scaled earthwork structure in America. I'm probably 75% there. But when you look at like Newark, has anybody here ever been to the Newark Earth Complex or familiar with that? Okay, now a lot of it is obscured, but we have this incredible work and surveys of Squire and Davis, who went around and surveyed. They spent years and years surveying the extant monumental earthworks, like mostly into pre-Civil War times, which have been erased. The scale and extent of this is it's staggering to contemplate when you realize how vast was this system. And I probably would like to show you some of that. And I'm talking with Beckett and his team about taking some of those old surveys and creating new updated models. Now we have, and Luke Caverns is doing very interesting work with LIDAR that's showing that there's a lot of these structures that you don't really even see from the surface. They still exist subsurface, and it's going to allow us to recreate this system, I think, in ways that would have been completely impossible even a few years ago. So I'm hoping that we can form a project here and start doing that. I do 3D modeling with my architectural work. So I am attempting to do a 3D model now of the Mound City complex. And what that does is the software that I use allows you to, for example, it doesn't include the moon, but I can set up and look at the angles of the sun, the relations of the sun for any time of year on any place on the earth. So it's a very powerful tool, and I do sun and shadow studies for every structure we design and build. Well, I'm going to apply that same thing to these the ancient structures, starting probably with the earthworks, because I think that the monumental earthworks of America are one of the overlooked. And the reason is because made of earth, they're not as durable as structures made of stone, obviously. But many of these structures, truncated pyramids, had temples on them that were built of timbers, of trees, in some cases imported from long distances away. How many of you have been out to Chaco Canyon? All right, looks like about a third of you maybe. So Chaco Canyon was a hub of a huge cosmological civilization. that filled the whole San Juan Basin all the way up to Chimney Rock. Chimney Rock was part of that cultural expression. And the whole thing is laid out as a map of the heavens. And I think there's a reason for that, because it gets into the alchemical principle of as above, so below. And when you have these two domains that are reflections of each other, you get resonance. And the idea was to bring the heavenly energies to earth, and the earth energies bring them up. The temple, the chamber, the pyramid, whatever form it took, was a means of fusing the energies of the heavens with the energies of the earth. And from that point, then, those energies could go out and let's say, reinvigorate the wasteland. And that's the central secret of the whole Grail, the Grail mythos, is that it comes in the aftermath of a great catastrophe that lays the land to waste and causes the king to fall into a great sickness or a wound that never heals. And when the various, whether it's Galahad or Percival or whoever it is, in the various stories goes out and recovers the Grail is the antidote. The Grail is what brings the wasteland back to life in the stories. It also revives the ailing king. There's also versions of the story, earlier versions, where it might be the queen who's ailing. But the point is, I think, of the Grail is that the Grail is a symbol. It's an antidote for not only what heals the wasteland, but to heal the wasteland, but also to heal humanity. And it's the same principle, the same force. And so I've studied many, many hours immersed into the stories of the Grail, and they're very, I don't know how to describe them other than maybe they're dreamlike, because what happens is as you immerse yourself in those stories, you kind of get transported to another realm. And it's very dreamlike, because in dreams there'll be a character that enters your dream. And it's somebody you know or recognize or whatever, and then suddenly they transform and they're somebody else completely different. You've had that, right? In your dream, everybody's had that. So you have this kind of feelings that you get, this sense when you immerse yourself into the Grail stories, that they're very dreamlike. But each of the Grail stories, I mentioned the other night the work of Wolfram von Eschenbach and Robert Deberon and Thomas Mallory and Chrétien de Troyes and several of the others that were anonymous. There's been great confusion, particularly amongst academics, like, how do we make sense of this? Because in one case, it's a chalice, right? It's described as a chalice. But in another case, it's described as a plate. And in another case, it's described as a disembodied head. And it goes on. There's multiple incarnations of the Grail, and trying to make sense out of it until you realize that each of these authors is describing a distinct part of the ancient technology. And the Grail stories, which were set down over a 50-year period from about 1175 AD to about 1225, right in there, same time as the Cathars, the Troubadours, the Albigensians, the Kabbalistic schools in Spain. The Tarot deck emerged out of that same milieu. There was just the Templars, the Freemasons, and the building of the Gothic cathedrals. It was an incredible time of cultural expression, and all of these things coming together. And when you begin to understand and appreciate the scale of the Gothic phenomena, you're talking about 80 great cathedrals on the scale of Chartres and Reims and Amiens and Sens and Leon and Rouen and Bourget and on, about 80 of them. And if you haven't, get your ass over to Europe and tour some of these cathedrals, and you will be awestruck when you look at the programs of sculpture and stained glass and the amazing engineering that had to take place. Then realizing that these cathedrals are not randomly placed. In fact, every one was placed upon sites of much older ancient sanctity that reached deep into the pagan times. And basically, they were taken over, and the cathedrals were built like you can go to Chartres Cathedral. Here's interesting. You walk in, you know there's a labyrinth in Chartres, right? You walk in the front door, these great big front doors, which are based upon the Route 3 rectangle. You walk in those doors, and as you stand at the sill there, in front of you is this big labyrinth. And behind you, above you, is the great rose window, right, with its 12-fold geometry. Well, if you hinge the facade of Gothic Cathedral, of Chartres Cathedral, and you hinge it down, the rose window is the same size as the labyrinth, and it juxtaposes exactly on top of the labyrinth, right? The labyrinth represents the cosmic journey. And when you put that labyrinth onto the great rose window that represents the heavens and the 12 signs of the zodiac, it's marking out a cosmic journey. Underneath is the crypt. And down in the vault, under the crypt, in the crypt, there's a deep well shaft. And at the bottom of that well shaft, and I have photographs of it, you see the water table, right? If you're standing at the labyrinth, the water table is the same distance below your feet as the arch of the ogival vault is over your head. Coincidence? Or is it part of the capacity of the vault to capture energies emanating up from the water moving through the fault lines that cross under Chartres Cathedral? See, they were not only astronomers, they were also geologists. They were geometricians. They were symbolists. And all of these things came together. And all of these criteria that you see here, these parameters, you find them present in every sacred complex or temple around the planet going back for thousands of years. That's why I say that there was a consistent template that they were all working from. Now, if that's true, then it raises this question. What was the origin of that template? Where did it come from? Where was the legacy that gave this to humanity? And I don't know the answer to that. I have some suspicions, but I don't know. But clearly, you can't dismiss this as coincidence. And the mainstream tries to do that. So here's just another way of displaying the parameters: symbol, number and measure, geomantic survey, omphalos. What is omphalos? The sacred center. And that is found by someone who can map the energies of the earth. How many of you know what dowsing is? Oh, a lot of you. Anybody you ever done any dowsing or seen dowsers at work? What's that? He has a dowsing rod in his truck. Okay, it's real. Dowsers can detect subtle energies in the landscape, particularly associated primarily with water, especially moving water, and also different types of minerals and ores and so on. I had my own experience with a dowser, and this was one of those key things that happened to me back in that period of fermentation in the early mid-70s when I was just becoming aware of a lot of this stuff. I was building out, I had, in the group that I belonged to, that it was a group of Sufis, and we may in a little while actually be doing some Sufi drumming, which is a legacy of that period. But there was an architect and a successful businessman, and the businessman was building a new house out by the Chattahoochee River that runs in Georgia, outside of Atlanta. And I was known to be a Mason, now not a Freemason, but somebody who actually laid bricks and stones and stuff like that, which I did a lot of until my back said, no more, stop. But so this architect came and said, hey, this guy Ron, the businessman, wants to build a house, and he wants the second floor of it to be an exact replica of Khufu's pyramid. Wow. Okay. He said, but we need to get the foundation built, and I understand that you can lay block. And I said, yeah, I can lay block. So me and one of my brothers went out there and we spent a couple of weeks of some of the hardest work I've ever done, digging the footing trenches by hand, pouring the concrete footings, and then laying up the block foundation. And then we got it done. The architect comes back and he says, you know, we don't have any carpenters here. Do you guys want to stay on the job and do all the carpentry? We said, sure. So we did, and I had to figure out how to build a replica of the Khufu's pyramid, 51.85 degrees, and the owner wanted no steel in it. Only copper could be used. And it was sheathed in copper, and it was multi-layered. It was very interesting. So one of my main things that I remember was these darn copper nails are so soft. I want to, you know, because you bent as many copper nails trying to put that thing together as you managed to successfully nail in and get two pieces of wood connected. But we got the thing done, and then fella, he was one of the Woodruffers, that lived up the river a ways, and he would drive by every day, and I'd see him looking out of his truck, saw us building the pyramid and stuff. He comes out and he says, one day he says, when you guys finish here, come down and talk to me. I've got some projects if you're interested, you know. And so, yeah, okay, we went down there. We built decks and boat docks and stuff out into the river, me and my brother. And then he came and he said, I've got 15 telephone poles. Can you build a barn? He had these boats, and he said, I need a place to put my boats. Can you build a barn and use these 15 telephone poles? And I said, sure. So we go out there, and I drew up some plans, and what I figured was we'll put these telephone poles vertically, just set them in the ground. And so I came up 3 rows of 5 each, right? And then at that time, Ma Bell, which was the telephone company in North Georgia, had a service. They would come out with their big auger truck and drill the hole and use their boom to set the telephone poles for you and charge you $8, okay? So we thought that was a pretty good deal. So we call up Ma Bell, the official, you know, company truck comes out with the big boom on the back and the big auger drill, and it stops there up on the road. It was just a gravel road. And I'm down on this flat floodplain where we're going to build this barn. They stop. I could see there was a guy sitting and riding shotgun, somebody driving, and then there was like a crew cab. Back door opens, and this tall, skinny guy gets out. He's wearing overalls. He's got an old crumply black hat on, and he's carrying what looks like a violin case. And he comes walking down, and he's looking. And before we called him out, I had figured out everywhere where I wanted a telephone pole to be set. So I had stakes in the ground at each location. And he comes down, opens up his what looked like a violin case, and he takes out 2 swing rods. You know what swing rods are? Yeah. He had swing rods, and all they were was the old-fashioned telescoping automobile antennas with the little ball on the end, and he'd cut them off so there was a sleeve he could hold, and then they were bent at 90 degrees. And he comes out, and he starts walking, and he walks over each one of my stakes, and I'm looking there because I kind of had heard of water witching, but I'd never actually seen it or given it much thought. And they're just, the rods are kind of just doing this, you know. And he's walking, and he goes over each of the stakes that I'd placed in the ground, and he calls up to the 2 guys at the truck, clear. He walks to the next one, clear. Eventually, he walked to all 15 of the stakes. All of them were clear. And at first, I'm like, what is this? Are these guys pulling a fast one on me, or what is this? Well, I was glad that he seemed to confirm that they could drill each of those places. Then he starts walking over towards the main house, and I knew that the water main came in from across the road, went under the driveway into the house, but I didn't know exactly where. So he's walking with his swing rods, and they're just doing this. And he gets about midway through the drive, and I'm watching. My brother is driving. We're both watching. All of a sudden, the swing rods do this. They go like this, and they bend. They literally cross over, and they bend, like somebody's taken the ends of them and done this. And then he steps a few steps across, and they relax, and they go back to doing this. And then he does this zigzag walk up to the street, up to the road. And each time he crosses over, the same thing. The swing rod's crossed, and he was able to trace out exactly where the water line comes in. And I'm standing there looking at that, and he goes, turns to me, he goes, "You want to try it?" Sure, I'm game. I'll try anything once. Well, not every. I have a few limitations. Back then, I had fewer limitations than I do now. But so I said, okay. I took it. And I'm like, okay. And I'm walking across. And I swear to God, I stepped across that spot, totally innocent, unexpected, that anything was going to happen. And it was like I got a shock. And I felt like somebody grabbed the ends of these swing rods, jerked them into an X pattern, and I could feel it. And I was able to exactly trace it out. And I've done a lot of dowsing since then, never with that intense of an effect. I've thought about why, many times later, why did I get such a strong response? Well, I know why now, because the presence of the master dowser there somehow affected my field in a way that made me hyper-responsive. And that was when I really came to start believing there are subtle energies in the earth. You know, it was no intellectual, it was purely experiential. But I came to believe there are energies in the earth, and they are detectable. Now, I've come to since believe that, animals, birds, bats, all kinds of animals, fish in the sea detect these patterns. We all know that, for example, before a seismic event, oftentimes the animals will disperse, they'll leave, right? Well, I think that our ancestors were much, much more attuned to those patterns of energy in the landscape, even detecting it just by their hands alone. And when you start looking at a lot of the Egyptian iconography, you'll see that they're doing things with their hands. In fact, I could show you something very interesting where some of the gods, Osiris and Tahut, are doing their hands, or they're raising Osiris. They're resurrecting Osiris from the dead. If you look at their hands, and then what I found out when I joined Freemasonry was they're doing the same rituals. They're doing the same rituals. And they don't even know what they're doing. But that's okay because they're preserving it for us, for the rest of us, right? So now, if we go into the history of this, we're looking at the great work, 3rd millennium BC.
Hey, Randall.
Within 100...
Hey, Randall, can I jump in? We could just start heading towards wrap up soon, just to let you know we're at 9 o'clock.
Okay.
And then afterwards, Matt's going to do an interview with you.
Yeah, I'm ready to wrap it up within the next 4 hours.
I just wanted to let you know.
No, I'm not really. That was a joke. Okay, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, something like that?
No, a little more than that.
10 minutes, okay. Okay.
There's a clock right here.
Okay, so shut the hell up and I'll keep going here. Robert, I didn't mean. So all of this is happening like within the same 2 centuries, right? You've got the construction of the massive megalithic structures and earthworks in the British Isles and Northwest Europe. You got the building of the pyramids. Now I'm going to excuse Khufu from that because I think Donini's work is accurate, that the Khufu's pyramid at least was much older. But most of the development on the Giza Plateau, I think, has been dated to this 3rd millennium BC. The construction of the great urban complexes of the Indus Valley, the building of the ziggurats and other great temple complexes in the Mesopotamian Valley, and the first wave of monumental earthworks in North America. Watson Break, Poverty Point, and a number of others. Well, what you have to understand here and visualize is that all of these great construction projects are happening simultaneously. And they all began almost in a No time at all. When we go back to the building of the Gothic cathedrals, 1200 AD, I'm just citing these as a couple of examples. We had the flowering of the Gothic in Europe, the construction of pyramids and vast temple complexes in Central and South America, the building of vast temple complexes in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and the final construction phase of massive stone and earthwork complexes in North America, the Hopewell and the Anasazi out here in this area. Now, again, within 1 century or century and a half, all of these things are happening simultaneously. So if you could go back and, get in a helicopter and fly around, you'd see these tremendous construction projects happening simultaneously. Now, in many cases, the initiation of these projects, just like this is one of the great architectural historians discovering, in one of the standard textbooks of architecture, he says this: we find ourselves in the midst of technical advances without parallel. Now he's talking primarily about Egyptian history. Technical advances without parallel in Egyptian history. The new problems of using stone as a building material were solved with astonishing quickness within a single century. Dimensions of the stone blocks grew ever larger, from the small 25-centimeter ashlars of Zozer's complex to the large limestone blocks of the Giza pyramids, and up to the megalithic boulders of 18 to 30 tons that compose the so-called Temple of the Sphinx near Kefren's Valley Temple. So this is in Egypt. Okay, so now we have Andrew Perrott, who wrote The History of Sumer in the Dawn of Art, and he says, now that we can view the Mesopotamian basin in all its splendor, it is becoming clear that this flame, which blazed up so suddenly in the Middle East and shed so wide a light, was kindled at several points, each with its own nuance and distinctive luster. Susa, Lagash, Uruk, Ash, I won't try to pronounce them all, but Nineveh, Assur, all alike were centers whose civilization advanced from strength to strength until at last, thanks to the genius of the few and the boldness of many, there was wrought forth, as in an alchemist's crucible, a prodigious many-sided art. And this is, when you look at this, this is the same thing. It's almost as if the whistle blew, the bell rang, whatever, and in multiple places around the world, these teams of these master builders who were waiting in the wings with their tools ready to go, they emerged and started building these amazing things. And all of this is going on at the same time. They finish up the projects, and then they disappear into the mists of history, and we don't know who they are. But that seems to be the pattern that is repeated over and over again. Christian O'Brien, an engineer who wrote this back in 1983, The Megalithic Odyssey. Perrott was writing of a period that covered the first half of the 3rd millennium BC. And it is unlikely to be a coincidence that this period also saw the development of the Egyptian pyramids, from the first brick-built structure of the step pyramid at Saqqara, about 2850 BC, to the gargantuan stone structures of the Great Pyramid some 2 centuries later. The building of the older ziggurats of the Mesopotamian Valley. The building in Britain of giant earthworks of Avebury and Silbury Hill and the first stages of Stonehenge. The construction of the astronomical complex of stone circles and giant cairns in Bodmin Moor. After millennia of quiet evolution, the civilization of man was suddenly on the march, and the intriguing question arises as to whether Egypt, Sumer, and Britain have a common heritage from this period. And I think we can now answer that question definitively and say, yes, they did. He goes on to say, and this is where we get controversial, and this is where Graham Hancock has been attacked by the main defenders of the mainstream status quo. The most consistent of all traditions concerns the civilizing and teaching of primitive peoples by a group of itinerant sages the orally transmitted tales of which have the same flavor from Central America to the Persian Gulf, from North America to Japan, and from Europe to Oceania. Well, who were these itinerant sages? Well, I think we can speculate somewhat intelligently now that they were the carriers of the tradition that has survived the previous catastrophes. Because what the legacy of those times tells us is that Plato is very clear on this, that there were survivors of two categories. The survivors who survived because of the luck of the draw, they happened to be in the right place at the right time, and the survivors who did so because that's what they intended. They prepared, they knew there was a catastrophe impending, and they made steps to survive and to preserve certain traditions of art and architecture and science. And this actually is the core tradition of the Masonic order to this day. Whether it was Lamech or Enoch, the story is the same. Enoch knew that the great flood was coming. So he made steps to ensure that some element of the ancient knowledge would survive. And there's a whole tradition about an underground lair or underground sanctuary that he carved out with 9 chambers, and he encoded all of the knowledge into a cube that was set in the midst of the 9th chamber. Then there are other legends about those who actually took refuge by leaving the planet itself. Now that's a whole another can of worms to open up. But what I've said numerous times to people is that we need to kind of reconsider some of our thoughts about aliens and so on. Now, this is not by any means the final explanation of the whole UAP phenomena. But I think we need to seriously consider the idea that at least some of those visitors to our planet are not aliens as much as it's us coming back. Just start thinking about that. The sages burst on the prehistoric scene, fully born. As it were, they had no antecedents. They entered from the wings of every stage on which they were recorded without any whisper of their world beyond the stage door. The only nebulous comments we have are out of nowhere and out of the heavens. Unhappily, their direct participation in the play is limited. They only come on in Act 1, and their departure is as sudden as their arrival. But as the curtain rises on Act 2, the play comes to life. Other indigenous men of knowledge have taken their place, and I would say also women. We know that there were very wise women who were also keepers of the Grail. In Babylonia, scientifically minded scribes were recording elementary mathematics and astronomy. The planet Venus was being closely monitored and its movements carefully studied. In Egypt, the priests of On were jealously guarding an occult knowledge which was to be kept within the Freemasonry of a few right down to the present day. In Britain and the continent, on the continent, the Druidical schools were being formed, which were to hold knowledge to be their hereditary right, to the extent that Julius Caesar was to write of them that they were the interpreters of the mysteries of religion, being such as could make discourses to their scholars concerning the stars and their motions, the magnitude of heaven and the earth, and the nature of things, and the power and majesty of the immortal gods. In the work of Louis Charpentier, in the Mysteries of Chartres Cathedral, he says, if we confine ourselves to Gothic art, this alone puts a question to which no answer has ever been given. We know all about Romanesque origins. We follow the path from monument to monument, period to period, but the Gothic has always eluded attempts to fix its origin. The historic question remains posed. It appears suddenly, without preamble, towards 1130. In a few years, it reaches its apogee, born whole and entire without experiment or miscarriage. And the extraordinary thing is that all at once, it has at its disposal master craftsmen, artisans, builders, enough of them to undertake the construction of 80 huge monuments in less than 100 years. But how do we explain that the labor force was so easily found and so soon put to work? One does not have to be a member of the craft to realize that the building of the cathedral at Chartres was not the work of apprentices, and that all concerned, carpenters, stonecutters, and masons, were masters of their art. However, between 1194 and 1220, churches and cathedrals were being built throughout France, churches and cathedrals that were not the work of apprentices. In Normandy alone, not far away, there were built in the 12th century 15 great churches, of which 8 were abbeys. In the 13th, 13 of which 5 were abbeys. For the whole of France, we must reckon that between 1150 and 1250, 150 monuments were put in hand, among them the churches of the dimensions of those in Paris, Reims, Amiens, Sens, Rouen. How was it possible to assemble qualified labor so quickly? So I think we're probably getting to the end of this, but what I've shown you tonight, I think, is just sort of the preface to a whole emerging body of knowledge and insight that we are now going to be privileged to access. And from multiple venues, from multiple streams, this knowledge is now pouring forth. And the metaphor or analogy that I use to try to get some conceptual grasp of this phenomena is like a great underground river that flows for a long time undetected to the people above on the surface. And then every so often, when all the confluence of forces are aligned in just the right way, the river emerges on the surface of the land. And now it becomes visible to all. A river of knowledge and wisdom and light that says, you are here on this planet for a reason. You've been sent here and you've been given a mission. Now it's time to reawaken you to that mission, and it's time for you to once again take your trowel in hand and get to work. And what I'm interested in now is what is going to be the next incarnation of the great work, upon whom it is now our responsibility to undertake and to initiate. What is going to be our contribution to the great work? How are we going to pick up where the master builders of the Gothic cathedrals left off and continue the great work of the ages? And I'm going to leave you with that, and I want you to think about that, and we will be continuing to disperse as much of this information as I've been able to collect together now over almost 60 years. So from that, we'll conclude. Thank you. What now?
I'm going to ask you one question, Randall. I'm going to ask Randall a quick question. Take a seat, Randall.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now, this is just going to be something that I know you wanted to talk about, but didn't have a chance to.
Okay.
Due to that. But as most people know, you're a teacher at heart, teacher at soul, but also one that we've all learned from. And you have this deck, and you're talking about builders. You're talking about people who have crafted amazing things, and the evidence of this over generations and generations and thousands of years. And you are currently going through that undertaking yourself with Cosmogonia and the school that you're trying to build. Who here knows about Randall's school? You guys heard of Cosmogonia? Well, I think it's important that you tell people a little bit about that vision and what you're trying to build and how they may be able to get involved and push this forward.
Sure. Well, as I kind of went into, these years of teaching led me to have certain philosophy of education and how we can bring up young people. And I have spent many, many hours contemplating. And, I've organized tours specifically for children and young people, going out, teaching them about nature, taking them out and learning about the fluvial processes, geology, learning to recognize the stars, the constellations. And as I've been doing this, research has been coming out demonstrating the importance of people reconnecting with the natural order, especially children. And there are now studies confirming that children that are regularly exposed to nature grow up psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually much healthier. Specifically, what it translates into is less depression, less suicides, less divorces, less addictions across the spectrum. Exposure to nature, and in fact, when children are even exposed to nature from a younger age, there are actually structural changes in their brains that can now be measured. And those structural changes are directly associated with a much better life, a much better orientation to the world and to reality. And so learning that, I had intuitively come to that conclusion. And then within the last 3 or 4 years, I had access to these studies that now verified, that were published. I said, okay, I knew that, but now we have objective verification. But it's not just children, it is everybody. It's especially important for young people whose brains are, developing, but it's important for everybody. And being exposed to certain ideas as well. And that's where sacred geometry comes in, because sacred geometry exposes you to certain patterns and forms that are literally the basis of harmony. And this is why these structures are so important. These structures are textbooks that are teaching us about this legacy, this tradition that our ancestors were aware of. So I begin to think, the 2 things that I've mainly done in my life to validate my existence here is to build and to teach. How do I bring those 2 things together? Well, build a school. Build a school using all of the parameters that I showed you up there. What would happen if there's nowhere that I know of today that is happening. Although I think it is going to happen, because I'm not the only one who has began to connect the dots here and see these principles. But I came up with the term, the Greek term, cosmogonia, from which we get the word cosmography and others. And it literally, cosmo means the universe or the world, and gonia means to create. So cosmogonia literally means world creation. And that's what I want to do. I want to, many more decades that I have, hopefully many, but I would like to plant the seeds of a new world and revive these ancient principles and resurrect them in a modern form. Using the technologies and the science of our own time, and what could our efforts be if we now take up the mantle of the great work, which is sort of the term that has come down to us to describe this. And see, there's so much we didn't get into. But and I've learned this again from my participation in the craft and independent reading and so on, that when they gathered to build, they would build not just, we're here to make money and let's get done. They actually ritualized the building with the idea in mind that they were externalizing a state of consciousness ritually. And so this was, of course, the whole purpose of ritual all along, was to link the activities that you're doing externally with the internal world of your consciousness. And yeah, so that was sort of, and I've tried to do that on my jobs, and many of the Bulgarians that came and worked for me actually came from some very profound spiritual traditions. And they were totally, you know, supportive of that idea. So we, you know, literally ritualize our projects and look at the projects as a way of meditation, as a way of integrating ourselves and our consciousness with the material world.
You built some incredible stuff.
I will add this one thing. There are times in the life of humanity on this planet when it's the best strategy, the best approach to the external conditions is to actually withdraw from the world, to become a monk, to become the hermit. This is, you know, to enter the monastery. When I studied with the Swami, he had literally been raised in a cave at 18,000 feet in the Himalayas, and then came forth. And there's a very long, interesting story behind his mission in the world. And I was very privileged to have met him firsthand and was able to experience directly the transmission of the energies that he brought with him. And so, but there are other times, you know, during the Dark Ages, let's say between 536, 540 AD up until the beginning of this incredible milieu that we're talking here, there was not much you could do other than to preserve the knowledge and the wisdom. So this is what the monastery was for. It was for a withdrawing from the world. But at other times, it requires going forth into the world and engaging with the objective world, picking up tools and going to work. We're in that time now. We're in a time that now requires us to engage with the world and to lift the world to the next level of vibration, if you want to put it.
We are,
put it
yes,
that
and
way.
people are waking up and they're seeing it
Yeah.
all over. So your school is going to connect the work that you've done with sacred geometry, with your building work, with catastrophism, with 60 years all put into curriculums and created as a digital and physical manifestation of it.
We're going to start with the digital, and that's where our alliance comes in.
And everybody hears. Most people here discovered this all digitally, so.
Okay, yeah. And that's the interesting now is we have the digital world, but of course, you know, and hey, I love being able to talk to people on the other side of the continent, on the other side of the world. You know, I mean, this was almost beyond my imagination as a growing up that we could even do. That was total science fiction, what we're doing. But that's no substitute for, like we're doing here, gathering and meeting each other face to face. But the one can complement the other.
Yes, it can.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Randall. Give it up for Randall.
Okay.
That will conclude us for the evening.
Thank you.
I got you.